I'd like to welcome everyone to this event and introduce the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Wartina Davis.
So welcome everyone to our university teach-in entitled, Is This Who We Are? Humanities and Social Sciences teach-in surrounding the assault on the nation's capital. This event is co-sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the American Democracy Project. I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Ellis for his support. Some may be wondering, what is a teach-in? The first known teach-in was in the mid-60s, and it was inspired, university faculty were inspired by the idea of engaging students in complex and timely issues. Today, we are continuing that tradition by holding a teach-in to discuss the assault on the nation's capital, informed by the lenses of the disciplines of the humanities and social sciences. So I'm incredibly excited about this presentation today, the presentations today, and look forward to being enlightened and engaged, and would like to encourage individuals who are participating when in the Q&A section to really engage, because teach-ins are not lectures. They are participatory moments where people should engage with the concept. So please, as the presentations are going forward, take a minute to think about what are your questions or what are your comments that you would like to share in this community, this shared community where we are learning. It's a teach-in where we learn together. I'd like to give special thanks to James Miles and Tia Cherry for their helping to organize this event, and special with an asterisk to Dr. Ian Marshall, who serves as the Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, for really pulling this together, and an incredible, it was quick, again, it's supposed to be timely. And so engaging and pulling together this absolutely stellar group of faculty who will be presenting today. So thank you, Dr. Marshall, for your leadership. I'm so excited about today, and I welcome everyone to participate, as I said earlier, and let's get started.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, Dean Davis, and I'd like to introduce our first panelists, Dr. Danielle Wallace and Dr. Elizabeth Heinz.
Good morning.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here. So we all saw, or either live as it was happening, or watched in the endless replays of footage on the news, what happened at the Capitol earlier this year. Many of us are still trying to process what happened and still wondering how we can get to that point, because this is not the America that we have been told that we live in. Our educations have taught us that this country is a beacon of democracy and equality, and that everyone here has a fair shot and a fair chance. This message runs deep. So in responding to the insurrection, the first approach is often denial. On the day of the insurrection, President Biden, then President-elect Biden, spoke to the nation and denounced the actions taken by the group at the Capitol. And he also denied that this was representative of this country. He said, "Let me be very clear. The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are." However, many people, those who are most vulnerable and have the least power, heard that and said, "Is it? Or isn't it? Despite the gains we have made over time, isn't it who we are and who we have been?" And so, in order to help answer that question, I want to look at history, or look to history, and specifically to Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. This is a story of the post-Civil War, post-enslavement South. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have been passed. Enslavement is largely illegal. The formerly enslaved are now considered citizens, and Black men have voting rights. Though these factors have changed life significantly in Wilmington. This means that we've got some things happening. Wilmington at this time was the largest city in the state of North Carolina. And it also has a population that is majority Black. About 55% of the residents of Wilmington are Black. In the time since enslavement and since the war, the formerly enslaved were able to make significant headway in those years. There's a heavy presence of Black professionals, tradespeople like butchers and bakers and blacksmiths, people who are doing a lot of work and are able to make a lot of money. We also have a lot of Black elected officials serving in civic positions, people like the coroner, police officers, mail clerks, court clerks, all who've been elected by the residents of Wilmington. As a result, there is a strong and growing Black economic base and also middle-class population. However, this does not sit well with everyone. As a result of these changes, racial resentments are growing in Wilmington, in particular among the white residents, because the perception was that the Black residents of Wilmington were making strides, yes, but were not contributing enough to the society and to the town, and in particular in economic ways. There was concern over the fact that even though Black Wilmington residents served in large numbers in elected positions, they were not contributing to the tax revenue in the town. And so, as a result, a new campaign is developed to try and help reclaim political power in Wilmington. Southern Democrats, and I always have to remind us that the Democrats and the Republicans are very often seen differently at a certain point in time, right? There's a flip in how the political parties presented themselves and the things that they stood for. And so in the South during this time, the Democrats are the party of enslavement. They are the party of Jim Crow and segregation. And the Republicans are the party of Lincoln, or where you might find some abolitionists, and the party with which the majority of Black voters are registered. And so Southern Democrats are feeling like they had been pushed out of local government, and they wanted to get back the power that they lost as a result. And so a campaign has begun, and it is essentially, and quite literally, a campaign of white supremacy, utilizing white supremacist political strategies to try and draw in white voters to the cause of trying to regain power that was lost to these Black citizens. They developed this strategy of write, speak, and ride, trying to find individuals who could write political commentary and publish things in newspapers, who could speak and be orators and give speeches to, kind of drum up support in the base, and also people who could ride horses, because they could use those individuals to intimidate voters. They formed white supremacy clubs called the White Government Union, and also used propaganda about threats to white womanhood, arguing that these newly emancipated and empowered Black men were also a threat to the safety of white women and children. And then we found the formation of the Red Shirts, which was a democratic paramilitary group. One of the primary characters in this story is Alfred Waddle, who was a former congressman and who was put to the front as the face of this movement. And I have some quotes here, but one of the most important stuff is the stuff that I've got kind of bolded, right? Waddle played on the fears of white men in particular, that the state had been taken from them, their power had been taken from them, and that what they needed to do was reclaim that power. And that the only way they could do that, in particular in the upcoming election of 1898, was to use violence to do so, right? And so he says, bloodletting is what's needed for the health of the Commonwealth. And there's a time to kill, and we need to do that. And he also says, you have arms and you're prepared to do what you need to do to defend yourselves and defend your families. And so if you see any Black people voting, stop them. And if necessary, use violence to stop them. Kill them in their tracks. And so what happens is there is a coup, right? Despite the fact that the Southern Democrats are successful in stopping people from getting to the polls, they are not able to secure a win in the election. They also committed election fraud by replacing Republican votes with Democratic votes. And so they're able to make some headway in the election, but not able to retake the city government. And so 2 days after the election, an armed mob of 2,000 men proceed to march on the city government and overthrow that government. They rounded up elected officials, both Black and white, and forced them to resign from their positions. And they also expelled Black citizens from the city. In the process, they also patrolled Black neighborhoods, beat up Black citizens, burned down their buildings and their homes and their businesses. What we have here is an image of a group of men who are standing at the only Black newspaper in Wilmington that was burned to the ground during the coup. The editor of the newspaper was also run out of town because he was very vocal, speaking against some of the propaganda that was coming out. And in the process, killed between 60 and 300 people. Okay, so now you might say, Dr. Wallace, that's all fine and good. That's 1898. That's Wilmington, North Carolina. That's the South. This is the North. Well, and this is 2021. Well, let's see what kinds of parallels we can find. First is in regard to the framing and rationale. The insurrection of January 2021 is similar to that insurrection in 1898 because of the focus on this fear of lost power, right? And the need to save democracy or the country or the Constitution, because there is this belief that all of this is being stolen and taken over by people who are undeserving. There's also a fear of treasonous politicians. Central to the conflict between the Democrats and Republicans was the fact that many Democrats felt that white Republicans were traitors to their race. And so this idea of treason is also present. And then also protection of family, right? We talked about the idea that there was this propaganda used to talk about the threat that Black men pose to Black women, to white women and children, excuse me. And that is also present. So what I have here are excerpts of some of the speech that Donald Trump made on the day of the insurrection. And again, the most important parts bolded and italicized. That idea of election victory being stolen, right? Taking back our country with strength and not weakness. And also the fear of the indoctrination of children, right? They're going to poison your children's minds. They're going to harm your families in some sort of way. An assault on democracy and the American people and taking back the country. We also see that there's the undercurrent of a shift in power leading to anxiety and resentment. So just as happens in 1898, when you see the Democrats being upset about not winning an election, here we have the loss of an election, right? That leads to this, again, fear and anxiety, a belief undergirded by a belief that certain people have a right to rule and certain people have a right to power, and that outsiders are taking over, whether those outsiders be undocumented immigrants, whether they be people of color, whether they be people who are not considered quote unquote real Americans, right? Who have quote unquote built this country from the ground up, that those people who were standing outside of the Capitol on January 6th were the ones who have done all of the work to build this country, to build this nation. And therefore, they have the right to be in power and the right to reclaim that power. There's also, right, imagery that we cannot ignore. Outside of the use of violent aggression, right, to try and force a specific political outcome, and the presence of white supremacist groups, militias, and paramilitary groups in the Capitol on January 6th, we also saw a prevalence of racist imagery, a noose and gallows outside of the Capitol building, which was, yes, a threat to politicians, but also reminiscent of a violent history that is tied to race in this country of lynching. the Confederate flag being paraded around the Capitol building, right? It was said pretty often that the Confederate flag didn't even make it into the Capitol building during the Civil War. And so to now see it in 2021, paraded around the Capitol building, hung on, in the Senate chambers, and hung in, there's a photo of a flag tucked into the arm of a statue so that the statue looks like it's holding the flag. And also a number of, you see anti-Semitic shirts that help to support this same type of imagery, okay? And so it is important for us to be aware of the fact that there are these connections, and that what we are dealing with is what some are calling a new lost cause. The phrase lost cause is very often used to refer to the Civil War and the loss of the Civil War by the South. And that the, kind of hearkening back to the good old days is tied to this nostalgia based in race. This instance is a direct descendant of racism, white supremacy, and the failed Reconstruction in our country. In particular, it is reflective of a failure on the part of all of our branches of government to protect human rights and all human beings in this country. And we are seeing the Reconstruction playbook, right? What happened in 1898 being played today as well. The January 6th insurrection is reflective of the same ideals and beliefs that drove the Wilmington coup. It plays upon the same fears tied to the loss of country and loss of power to quote unquote undeserving people who do not contribute and have not contributed in valuable ways to this nation. And so to end, I want to leave us with this quote addressing this question again: is this who we are? I'm seeing a lot of folks thinking, is this us? This isn't us, this isn't America. How could this happen? And on the kind of flip side of that, Black folks looking at that and being like, of course this is happening. Yes, this is real. Yes, this is America. Yes, this is everything that you and we are together. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. It's shocking, and those parallels are really amazing. How much hasn't changed over these many years. And I have some of the same problems as I study stereotyping and prejudice. Everyone always thinks that it's getting better, and we show as strong stereotypes and prejudice today as we did 50 years ago, 70 years ago. Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia, those changed our explicit attitudes or how we self-report, what we actually verbally state. But oftentimes what we've noticed is that a lot of the prejudices have gone underground, not notably for, in the cause of the insurrection. That makes actually my job easier as a research scientist. I don't have to use unobtrusive or implicit measures, but it does show that these things sometimes go underground, but then they emerge again, and they're always actually there. One question that I have for you, Dr. Wallace, is just in terms of allyship. Is there any sense of allyship in the 1898 uprising and kind of what you see today? Because I know that there are people who are shocked, downtrodden by this, and amazed. Do you have any sense of that, or can you speak to any of that?
So yes, there was. I think within, I think limits.
Yeah.
So the Republican Party at the time was a multiracial kind of coalition, or a biracial coalition, that you had white citizens and politicians who were willing to work in concert with Black politicians and Black citizens. However, when the time came to defend them, they were not found, right?
Yeah.
And they also buckled under the pressure of Southern Democrats. They were scared enough that they didn't show up on election day, even though they were able to still hold the government in terms of the election. They weren't there. And so when the time came to protect the Black community and to protect Black neighborhoods, those allies did not show up. Yeah. And so I think that there are absolutely allies and connections that are present even today. But the question is about showing up, right? Will those people show up as well?
That's right. That's excellent. Okay. So if I may, I'm going to talk for a little bit and then we're going to bring it back together, and then Dr. Wallace and I are going to have a conversation. I'm going to shift the frame of analysis. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Heinz. I'm a social and personality psychologist. And just first, I want to bridge some connections in terms of what I see there. And I do see some solid connections in our approaches, even though the frame of analysis or the unit of analysis is very different. Most notably in the feelings and perceptions of facts of injustice can be rationalized with aggression and violence on the part of the protesters. To the extent to which certain groups, in this case, white men and white women, experience relatively high status, they are very concerned and vigilant with the status quo because it advantages them. It supports their privileged positions. So they're going to be very sensitive to any kind of loss, and they're going to perceive that loss as threat, in need of remedy, and will justify aggression, violence, even burning down houses as a way of maintaining that, because they feel like the injustice has been done to them. But I'm going to change the frame of analysis a little bit, and I'll put up my PowerPoint slide in a minute, and just consider, and I take as a social and personality psychologist with expertise. I actually study first impressions and social perception and how we form opinions of people. And we know we do that on the basis of race, gender, a social class, and attractiveness and age. So those are the basic categories. We can't turn that off. And so that is a little bit of part of how we get to know people. We code that automatically. So I'm going to turn the frame of analysis from kind of like what fringe people do, or people who have lots of, anger in their hearts, and kind of look at the more kind of normal population. And I don't want anyone to take away from this conversation that the types of thought processes that go on in insurrections are the same or justifiable or explainable by some of the processes that I'm going to explain in this next one. They're very different, and most of us don't do the things in terms of aggression when we feel that sense of injustice. Okay, so I do want to draw that distinction. So let's start from there. Let's go. I'm going to bring up my share screen. I'm going to share my computer sound. Give me 1 second. Okay, so as Dr. Wallace said, is this who we are? She's a very nice ending there. I would say this is who we are and this is not who we are. Like I said before, I'm a social and personality psychologist. That doesn't mean anything to anyone. The one thing I do want to point out is that I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I don't do therapy. I'm not dealing with people who are experiencing psychological pain that interferes with their daily functioning. I study basic social interaction, how people think about, feel, and relate to one another. And I use a very evidence-based approach with numbers. So I've been charged with some of the numbers games. So just to introduce and welcome you here today, I have just a brief prologue. We're going to talk about 2 modes of thought, common mind habits, and then some mitigation, or how do we change some of the things that make us a little bit stubborn in our thinking, and maybe can explain why people have these facts of injustice, that they are motivated and reasoned to look for information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. But first, some numbers. I just want to talk about who we are as a community at William-Patterson. We have over 79,000 graduates that are part of our community. We have about 10,000 people right now in our college. 30% of our students are the first generation of students that are in their families that go to college. We were founded in 1855, before that first insurrection that Dr. Wallace talked about. And we have a student ratio, a faculty ratio of 14:1, which is one of the best places that I've ever worked. So, and we're very proud of that. We give a lot of individual attention to all of our undergraduates. And we come from 11 different states. this is who we are in terms of our racial and ethnic background. We are very diverse and compared to other organizations and institutions. This is our student body population. So we are diverse. We are designated a Hispanic serving institution as well. So we have a very, very mixed population here, which I love as someone who studies stereotyping and prejudice, inclusion, and diversity. We're also very age diverse. So because race and age, we're also a little bit more female than male, which is also very typical of many universities. So what does that mean in terms of who we are? We have lots of different majors. These are some more numbers in terms of that. And this is who I am. So this is my lab. We study stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination. I like to also put a little asterisk there. We're not trying to just understand it. We also look for methods for social change. So we're very motivated and develop strategies for mitigation. How do we change stereotyping, prejudice, bias, and so forth? Okay, so like I said before, studying the stereotyping and bias has made us develop additional methods for how we understand bias in our culture. Like I said before, the shift from 1954, the Board versus Brown of Education really marked a really important time in this nation's thinking about how race relations happen. And so we used to have a lot of overt racism. I think as Dr. Wallace really showed, people didn't have any, kind of compunction about it. They just did it. Now there is a little bit more mixed evidence that in terms of like how people express their particular attitudes. So I study bias and implicit bias specifically, but bias in general. Bias, like just in terms of level setting, these are the subtle, unexamined habits of thinking that are overapplied as we think, evaluate, perceive, and make decisions. Now, one thing that we know is that people are overloaded with information. They tend to use habits of thinking, heuristics, or rules of thumb. They can also, and we also are somewhat cognitive misers. In general, we don't think unless we have to, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. We tend to look for patterns, and that is part of the unconscious process. We are always using information outside of our awareness as we apply. Okay, so one thing that I want to level set on is that a lot of our mental life happens outside of conscious awareness, and that the thinking that occurs outside of awareness can actually contradict our stated beliefs. Okay, so we have what we call a dual attitude system that motivates our behaviors and our thinking, and so behavior is shaped by both our implicit and explicit attitudes. And what that means is that we can think that we are egalitarian, that we have that we treat people equally, that we see people in equal ways, but we can't help but think and maybe act even in prejudicial ways. So decades of research document this phenomenon, and oftentimes those implicit attitudes come out non-verbally. They're the ones that are less under our control. So in experiments and decades of looking at whites interacting with blacks, and whites oftentimes say that they're very egalitarian, that they don't hold any racial attitudes, but when they interact with people who are different from them, they are non-verbally very leaky. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, that they smile in their interaction, but they don't, they want to appear warm and unfriendly and unbiased, but they do the types of nonverbal behaviors that indicate discomfort. They sit further away. They are likely to give the smile that looks like this, that's not with their eyes, because they think they're smiling, but the real smile is the one with their eyes, but they're not actually doing it well. And so this can oftentimes lead to distrust and mistrust between people who are different, because the white person is oftentimes thinking, oh, I'm not biased, and the other person is saying like, yeah, that was just weird and uncomfortable. So there's oftentimes a mismatch in terms of what people think and what they're actually doing. I should also note that just because I've been studying this for 25 years doesn't make me immune to these particular types of effects. I'm very humbled by the research and how that when my attention is directed away, that I can oftentimes act in these ways even though I don't intend to. And I'll talk a little bit about that. My main area is sexism and racism. A lot of people think that if you're a woman, you can't be sexist. Nothing is further from the truth. Women are just as sexist as men. You wouldn't think that because they're disadvantaged by sexism, but we all grow up in the same kind of culture. And even though you may disavow, maybe what we call legitimizing myths or kind of, fallacies regarding, the way the world works, you can't help from that impact the way that you think about the world. And so in our field, we talk about the cultural thumbprint. It's not your thumbprint, it's the culture's thumbprint that is affected, that kind of creates a little space on your brain. And even though you disagree with some of those attitudes, they still affect how you categorize and think about people and think about yourself too. So that's always a surprising finding to me. We're cognitive misers, and a lot of people think here, I'm going to do a poll real quickly. I have to, let me go back to my poll before we, I want to ask everyone a question. Okay, so I'm going to watch, compared to other people, there's a poll up right now, and I just want to see, what do you think? Compared to other people, are you less, more, about the same biased as other people? Okay, I just want to get kind of your sense of things. I've been asking this for years. Okay. Once I have about 75%, I'm gonna put that away, and then I'm gonna bring it back because I want to show the audience a little bit about what people think. Okay. So about 40 of 66. Okay, I'll leave that up for a little while, and I'm gonna go on and then I'll bring it back a little bit later. So in general, this is Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman's research that we have two modes of thinking. There's system one, which is that fast, automatic. That's kind of like a preferred system that you see automatic patterns. It's quick decisions. That's the implicit mode of thinking. And then there's system two, which is effortful, evaluative, and like that's slower. It's harder to use. Most of us think that we are rational decision makers. If you ask people why they made the decision that they did, they can come up with a very rational conclusion. The data show that only 5% of our thinking happens in that rational mode, and 95% of it happens in that system one automatic outside of conscious awareness. That's very surprising to a lot of people. The thing is that your brain lies to you, and your brain likes to, system one is basically feeding information into system two and making it think that system two is actually doing all the hard work, when in fact system one is really in the driver's seat. So I'm always amazed. We have about 3.5 pounds of functional toothpaste between our ears that we think is an ally. It's oftentimes not, and we can be led to have erroneous or incorrect conclusions. So and these are highly likely to happen when we're rushed and stressed, when we're in an intense emotional state, when we have lots of power or status. That's an important one as you gain leadership positions and so forth, or when we're disengaged. Okay, so we rely on those things. So psychologists have identified over 250 types of biases, errors and judgments and thinking that allow us to have all these types of shortcuts. I would love to talk about all of them, but I'm going to pick out a couple for our discussion today in terms of how we can be misled to have, to be motivated reasoners. Okay, we are motivated to think in particular ways, oftentimes in service of how we feel about ourselves, but also how we feel about our in-groups and how we justify and how we should act in terms of these current events as well. So the one that I want to point out first is something called confirmation bias. It's the mother of all the biases. And confirmation bias is the tendency to look at or seek out information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs, and to deny, ignore, or distort information that does not confirm our beliefs. Psychologically and neurologically, we are primed to think in this way. It is a problem because if you only look for confirming evidence, you're not going to see the world very accurately. You're only going to see your standpoint in terms of reality. And again, neurologically, it feels good to be right. There's a release of dopamine when you're right. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter related to joy and calm and happiness. And when we are wrong, there's something in our prefrontal cortex, which is about this part of the brain. It's a little P300 wave. And that's that little jolt to your system when you get something incorrect. It feels bad to be incorrect. So we are somewhat prepared to seek out information to be motivated reasoners who try to look for information that confirms our beliefs. However, if you want to see the world accurately, and as a scientist, this is what we do in terms of our scientific method, we look for both confirming evidence and also disconfirming evidence, and look at the weight of the evidence as well, okay? But what this can do, this tendency for confirmation bias, can oftentimes create echo chambers of belief, motivated reasoning, seeking out people that already confirm our beliefs. And I think this has been going on a lot too. Maybe you've noticed it even during the pandemic. There's been so many different things in terms of, only kind of congregating with people who share your beliefs and not, having the full exposure as well, okay? And then also there's something called the illusion of truth. The extent to which you keep hearing the same thing, you tend to believe it more. Okay, so familiarity tends to lead to belief. So repeatedly hearing the same things over and over really feeds those kinds of standpoints. Okay, so I'm gonna, we have the things. So the first kind of big bias, along with confirmation bias, illusion of truth, is this bias blind spot. In general, we have an inability to recognize our own biases and an increased ability to recognize other people's biases, okay? This is called the bias blind spot. This makes us feel and think that we are that we are less biased than other people. So I'll just share these results. This is a common finding. The audience is very congruent with other research in this particular area. Most people think that they are 25% less biased than the average person. Now, I don't know if you remember anything about averages, but everyone can't be less biased than everyone else. So this is somewhat of a mental mind trick, okay? The reason why we believe that we are less biased than other people is because we don't see ourselves being biased, and we see other people being biased all the time. It's easier to see. So in terms of perspective awareness, that's why it happens. The problem with this is that if you think that you are less biased than other people, you are more likely to act in prejudicial ways in your interactions with others because you're not vigilant about how you're acting and how other people are perceiving you. This is called moral credentialing or moral licensing. The work of Emily Pronin shows that the less biased that people think that they are, the more likely that they are to act with bias in any given situation. It's almost like you have some more morality as a piggy bank, and that you've got lots of credit to spend, so you don't really kind of check in with your own behaviors as much. And so that's always really surprising to me. It's also made me very humble. I know that I act with bias, and so I'm always trying to think about, the situations ahead of time when we talk about those mitigation strategies in a minute, okay? So I'm going to quickly go through a couple other ones just to show you a little bit about this. Okay, so in-group bias is one of the most common ones. We tend to prefer things that are associated with the in-groups, and that's not necessarily that we always act with prejudice against out-group members, but that we privilege and we give benefits of the doubt, and we tend to recognize and individuate people in our in-groups more than we do out-groups, and that by consequence that often leads to discrimination. So over-privileging in-group members de facto kind of results in prejudice, but they can operate in opposition. So, that they go together sometimes, that people can have high in-group bias and high out-group bias, but sometimes they don't work in concert. So, for example, we know that self and in-group share neurocortex. You process information about those individuals more deeply. You tend to individuate them. You may know something called the cross-race recognition deficit. So whites oftentimes can't differentiate people among people of different races and ethnicities as much as other people. So whites have a harder time doing this, and so they make more mistakes. And these are kind of subtle cues in terms of unobtrusive measures of bias as well. And then that also it relates to empathy. So in-group members you share more empathy with, even in neurological studies of, a pinprick to the face, when it's an other race members, whites say, oh, that doesn't hurt so much. But when it's an in-group member, they're like, yeah, that hurts a lot. So even in terms of perceptions of pain. So these are well-documented findings. So Okay, and then standpoint bias. This is another one. We tend to believe that our perceptions are accurate and everyone is kind of stupid, dumb, and wrong. So that is a common thing. And everyone kind of constructs their own reality. I know that it feels subjectively, it feels like you are experiencing reality as it exists, but it really is a sampling of data in terms of it. And everyone comes to any particular position from a lot of different places. I'm a white New Jerseyan, you know, with an Episcopalian priest mom and a chemical engineering dad, where we were taught to welcome the stranger. You know, that's my kind of standpoint. You know, we were always kind of taught to, like, you know, bring in people who are different, you know, people who need a place for Thanksgiving or a place to have a meal. And so I think of myself as kind of being in the family business as a result of that. So, so just in terms of how that operates, I'm going to do a non-social example just so you can hear how this is going. Let me see. Let me go to the next one. Okay, so in order for this next poll, you need to have your volume up. I'm going to turn my volume up. I'm hoping that it can. Okay. Oops. Okay.
Laurel.
Oh, sorry.
Laurel. 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 Laurel.
Okay, so what I want to do is I need to go into my polls real quickly. And what do you hear? I'm going to launch that. What do you hear? What do you hear? I'm going to play that again.
Laurel. 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 Laurel.
Okay. What do you hear? So I'm going to share those results. Most of you hear Laurel. 45%, 32% hear Yanni. A lot of people say that they hear something else. Okay, so I do a non-social example just to kind of like, we all have the same sense information for the most part coming in our ears, but we construct it very differently. And I hear Yanni, and I can't hear Laurel. And a lot of social perception happens in this particular way as well, is that some people, you know, interact with people and they see one thing and another person has a completely different experience. People have that way when they watch news, you know, when they watch sports calls and so forth, you know, depending on which side of the issue that you're on, you actually construct a reality that's consistent with that. So I hope that makes sense, that given the same information, people walk away with very different standpoints regarding what's happening. And, you know, living in a particular different, you know, if you're in a different racial, ethnic group, gender group, and so forth, you do construct the world very differently. And there's no right or wrong. It is a difference of perspective. Okay. Okay, so like I said before, I do work not only on documenting how stereotyping and prejudice and the basic mechanisms, but also how to mitigate these. And when I talk to organizations, this is, you know, a lot of implicit bias work is like, oh, you just need to like think differently, or you just have to be motivated to like, you know, be brave and so forth. It's much more than that. If you're going to fight bias and you're going to really become more aware, it needs to happen at multiple levels, from the individual to the group, to the structural levels in terms of how things are. We've talked a lot about structural racism and sexism in the many years. And so you can't just like change society by changing individuals. It needs to happen from both directions. So I recommend having the shared language. Not do you have a bias, you know, because remember, it's easier to see it in other people, but is it possible we have a standpoint bias, or is it possible there's some illusion of truth, or is it possible that we're confirmation bias? Also having if-then plans, like thinking about like in particular situations and trying to change the behavior before you get to that thing. So I'm always like thinking about viewing my students as individuals rather than students, you know, like, oh, that's Yolanda and that's Henry and that's, you know, Jason and so forth. So that's something that I always work on at the beginning of the semester. They just look like a bunch of students. So I have to really override that general feeling. And in those moments, just slow it down. just stop and reflect and act, be mindful in the moment. And then the preventative measures that are debiasing processes. And that's when we talk about how we interview, how we hire, how we grade even. You know, I have a whole like grading procedure to make sure that I blind my grading. And so everyone is being treated equally in terms of the rubric and so forth. So these are just some of the top down and bottom up processes. And I'm just gonna slow down and just say thank you so we have enough time to discuss. So thank you all for that. And I'm gonna turn it back to Dr. Wallace, and then we're gonna have some conversation to kind of integrate these two approaches.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Heinz. That was really interesting. I was taking so many notes on what that all these things about bias mean, and in particular how it relates to then this group of people, right, showing up en masse to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, and then this group of people then moving into, you know, breaking into the Capitol building. So I have just some questions that we can, you know, maybe think about. What do you ended with that the action steps, right? And thinking about how we can challenge bias and biases, and what do you think that looks like on a day-to-day basis, right? In terms of challenging the biases in ourselves and also in others, because if we're living in this echo chamber, right, and we have all of these confirmation biases and we have all of these things that we're only hearing selectively, and we are cognitive misers, right? What does that mean for bias and how we are supposed to deal with that in ourselves and in others?
That's an excellent question. And there's so many different answers. I don't even know where to start. You know, so I think that, you know, what I recommend, be humble and be curious. Those are two really important things. And ask questions, and don't, you know, like actually listen. I know listening skills are kind of like, you know, not very fashionable these days. So and I always ask a lot of questions to people. I actually have friends who are on the other side of the political, you know, kind of from where I stand. And I'm always really curious, like, tell me why you think that. Like, what's your, I sometimes get a little snotty, like, tell me your evidence, you know, how do you know that? You know, what do you mean? You know, so there's a little bit of a drill down. And then if it's like a moral thing, like, so I oftentimes, you see injustices all the time when you're out in public, right? I mean, you know, I just had an amazing one happen to me recently, and it's be prepared with something to say to confront it. And so most times, you know, especially with sexism, I do research on combating sexism. Most women say like, oh, I would totally tell that person off if they said a sexist comment. Most people do nothing. They have nothing because they have nothing prepared. They're so amazed that it's actually happening that they oftentimes don't say anything. And that's tacit acceptance of the problem. Okay. And if you don't say anything, so have those kinds of things to say. My classic one, it's one that my mom taught me as the Episcopalian minister. She did it all the time when I was a kid. I was a little bit mortified as a kid, but happy now to have that in my toolbox is, what is your goal? What's your goal here? You know, and, you know, they oftentimes say, well, you know, they oftentimes kind of have this motivated reasoning. Well, I just was doing, I'm like, that's not, that may be your intention, but that's not how it's landing on us. And that kind of puts them on their back feet, and they may get angry, but hey, you know, sometimes you got to make people a little bit angry to get them to reflect. So I had no problem with that. And then, you know, so you just get to stir it up a little bit, right? Just to give that feedback, because I'm really against that kind of like, no one says anything because it's uncomfortable, especially as women. We're supposed to be nice and, you know, kind of like, you know, it's okay to, you know, call out sexism, racism, ableism, transgender, negative treatment as well. So, and then also, that's the first thing. Is the second thing is kind of surround yourself with people who you don't agree with. You know, that echo chamber is real, and seek out, you know, dissenting opinions. And, you know, you may emotionally not like the experience, but it may, you know, provide some things. So do you have anything to add? I mean, how do you kind of, you know, as someone who, you know, clearly is, you know, documenting the problem, you know, what can we do?
Well,
Any other advice?
I think you're absolutely right that part of it is about exposing yourself to opposite or alternate, you know, other ways of viewing and seeing the world. That if you are only reading and seeing things that confirm what you know or what you think you know, then that's what it is, right? And nothing ever changes. So I think that for me would primarily be it, right? And we are at a university and students have the opportunity to take courses and things that on issues that they may not have ever heard about or learned about in other courses. And so utilizing those opportunities, I think really help to broaden how we see and understand the world and maybe force us to look at those biases.
Yeah, that's excellent.
We've got a question in the chat.
Excellent.
That says, were the insurrectionists really fringe, quote unquote, fringe people? They hailed from all over the country and from many different positions, appearing to be, quote unquote, regular people. And so do you want to, I can let you take that one first and then I can respond as well.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a couple of other things. Can you, I'm having a hard time seeing the chat. Let me just make sure I can.
It might just have been sent to me. But,
oh, okay.
So, sorry about that. It says, were the insurrectionists really fringe people? They hailed from all over the country and from different positions, appearing to be regular people.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Without bringing them into my lab and giving them some tests, I would need to, to see where they fit on the norm. So, I mean, my guess is that just kind of using what we know from evidence is that they have a particular profile that I would say. So there's some work going on in the clinical psychology area that the tendency to look for like conspiracy theories and like people who believe in those kinds of fringe kind of things, that it actually makes them feel special and important. Like they think that everyone else is sheep, and so the believing in those conspiracy theories and all those kinds of things makes them feel what we call optimal distinctiveness. They feel distinctive in their character. That feeds their self-esteem. They get a lot of advantages and benefits by believing in those particular things. So it has a benefit, or it has a functional utility to them, and so they're not likely to disavow those kinds of fringe thinking anytime soon. So that is kind of the problem. It actually is supporting their ego. I mean, and that's, and most of what we do is in service of ego and self-esteem. So it's going to be hard to kind of break them. They like feeling different. They like feeling and superior by consequence. So so just to answer the question, there is a little bit of evidence coming out that I just talked to a clinical psychologist. We call them axis 1 schizoid, like there's like a whole like a DSM kind of profile for people like that. They tend to be a little bit more on the narcissistic side too. So the feelings of superiority, and then also kind of fragile self-esteem. And so that constant need to fill that sense of self. So again, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I just talk to a lot of them. A lot of them are my friends. So there is some sense of that. But, my argument, and I hope that was coming through, is that we do kind of have some ways of thinking that theirs are just kind of on super overdrive in terms of only having the mind guards, regarding their own beliefs and really seeking out the information that is going to feed their beliefs and not looking for just confirming evidence. And they're going to distort it. The other thing is that people have a hard time being wrong. I don't know if you've noticed that at all. It's a common problem.
I've seen it, yes.
Yeah. And so even when they're faced with information that they are incorrect, they think of their wrongs as almost right, and they don't change their beliefs. And so if you want to be kind of a more critical thinker, is like kind of accept the times when you're wrong and correct for that. So a lot of times when they're faced with their own racial or a sex bias, they say, well, I was trying to do the right thing, or, I'm like, no, you were wrong and you did something, or, and that's just harder. And so if they really try to rationalize or explain away why their behavior wasn't really that great, then they're never going to be motivated to change it. So that's an important part of that.
Okay, we have another question, unless you wanted to respond to that.
Oh, just really quickly, I think I can't remember exactly which organization is doing it, but there's an organization that's actually doing an analysis of all of the people who've been arrested since then, and looking at their overt affiliations with nationalist organizations or white supremacist organizations, because many of us have kind of said, okay, this is just a specific group of people. And what they found is that the majority of them are actually not affiliated with these organizations and have no connections to white nationalism or white supremacy, that these are just everyday people who have who showed up and felt that they were, you know, under threat. And so that connection is something that is important, because these are, yes, regular people, right? These are our neighbors and police officers. These are, you know, people in the military. These are teachers, lawyers, all of these people who we encounter on a day-to-day basis, who are, yes, very regular, but who have kind of been holding these biases to themselves to a certain extent until they can get to a place where they feel comfortable sharing them.
Yeah, and you know, it'd be really interesting. You know, I'm associated with Project Implicit. I don't know if you've ever taken implicit association tests. Those are some of the measures that I use in my lab. We have lots of data at Project Implicit. It'd be interesting to see if people's self-reported attitudes and their implicit attitudes in some places have gotten closer, because oftentimes they diverge quite remarkably, because they do tap into different attitude systems. But we could look at that data too from, I mean, we have millions of pieces of data on that. And we can also look at it by state, by county, and so forth. So we can kind of data mine that as well. So that'd be interesting to see is, you know, are people more brave, or are they changing their attitudes? So yeah, but the fact that just, you know, your point is well taken, Dr. Wallace, just about you know, that some of these people are surprisingly normal, and that's what we see with a lot of people who do kind of like terrible things, is that that some of this is in a lot of us, and to the extent to which we can think about, you know, how our thought processes, and not to go up the chain of inference and, you know, jump to conclusions and so forth, and really check in with our thoughts. You know, my son always says, check yourself before you wreck yourself. I'm like, that's actually kind of pretty good advice, you know, from an 18-year-old kid, you know. But yeah, just kind of stopping and thinking, and think about why your beliefs may not be true. You know, use that counter evidence. And that's what we're all trying to do as, I think, professors here, is to teach that critical thinking. Yeah, and to look at the weight of the evidence rather than just, you know, go down one path. So you know, think about alternative perspectives and alternative ways of seeing things. You know, and let me ask you this, you know, and I'm happy to start off with all the times that I was wrong. Totally, I can do this, but, you know, I like to be humble with it. But, you know, maybe someone would like to share like a time where they were like, they thought like the world worked this way, and then they found out other ways that they were actually wrong. I can give a real simple one to start. I used to think men and women were extremely different, that they were like, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And actually the data do not support that belief. I learned that in my Psychology of Women class in 1989, and it rocked my world. I was like, wait, men and women are more similar than they are different? No, because my personal experience didn't tell me that. You know, because if you think women and men are different, you're going to see that and look for information to confirm it, when in fact the opposite is true. So that was a hard lesson to learn. It changed my life. And now I teach Psychology of Women gleefully, and that's like one of the first things I say. So do you have any experiences where you thought the world worked one way and then you...
Absolutely. I still have those experiences on a day-to-day basis, right?
That's great.
Right. I think even what happened at the Capitol was one of those moments where I was like, hold on a second, this is not supposed to be happening. This is not how, even though, you know, I have this historical understanding of American history and race relations and politics, I was still kind of like, that's not supposed to happen. This is not supposed to be the way things are, and people don't do this, and that doesn't happen here. And so, you know, I have those biases every day. Yeah, and those awakenings, or rude awakenings, day to day.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Jim. Thank you.
Okay, our first question is from Bruce Diamond. Based on what methods we have discussed thus far, how do you know when we have achieved a fair, equitable, and inclusive society, or will it remain aspirational?
Oh, Dr. Diamond, that's such a tough question. How do we know? I mean, there are, I don't know how to answer this question. I mean, it would be great. I mean, I'm thinking from like a statistical standpoint, when our numbers in every area reflect kind of what our numbers are demographically in all areas of all professions. You know, that there is, you know, we have this kind of equal opportunity, right? I'd grown up in America. Everyone has a fair shot and equal opportunity. And that's one of the legitimizing myths. Like, no, we don't. There are certain things that keep people from from attaining their best, brightest, greatest potential. And so having, how do we know we've reached equality? I know that, just, can I give you an example from some organizations? And so right now, I'm doing some stuff with leadership and women in organizations. And like, I think the average in leadership or higher levels is about 13%, even though women's representation in all roles is about at 50%. And so some companies are just like, we just need to get it up higher, and so it's about movement towards that particular goal. Or with pay equity, they companies do analysis. We pay our women less than our men. Okay, well, let's change it. So one company that I know just like spent a couple $1 million making sure that all the J's men were the J, women, and they just dumped a lot of money into it, and therefore they don't have a pay gap anymore. So there are things that actually structurally, these are only structurally within, profit organizations. I know, I wish it were for everyone, but they're actually a good model for, hey, we can do these things. You just make it a goal, and then it can happen. So Bruce, Dr. Diamond, just to answer your question, there is always going to be some movement and always a little bit of slippage. And so we go back and forth, so I think we've made major strides. Title IX, for example, for women in athletics. I didn't grow up with a kind of knowledge that I would be an athlete, and I didn't participate. And now it's like really common, like the girls just like, of course you're going to do lacrosse and football and basketball and so forth, So sometimes the legislation has to come before the behaviors, attitudes, and the equality changes. And I think Brown versus Board of Education is such a great example of that. I mean, it didn't change everything, but it made some things. And Loving versus Virginia in the same kind of way in terms of interracial marriage, and then also with gay marriage too. Like back, when I was growing up, you couldn't be out at school, and now it's like so normal, and it's so normal for partners. So like the equality comes, and there's always going to be, I think, some implicit attitudes that are negative, but it's slow movement. Do you have any sense of that, Danielle?
Yeah, I would say that it's about the fundamental structural change that is what we need to see, right? And so, for example, it's great to put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill, right? But putting Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill doesn't improve the lives of Black people in this country, right? It is a symbol, it is a gesture, but more than gestures are needed. And so we need to be able to see, when we can see on, you talked about institutions, when we can see at an institutional level, say, at William Patterson, right, a faculty that is more reflective of the student body, those are strides that we can make to trying to bring about equality, and greater opportunity for people who are at the bottom of the economic scale. Those types of things, removing the barriers that are already put in place that prevent people from being able to access the equality that we are told we have access to. When we remove those, then we can talk about what real equality or equity or justice looks like. And it's not just about the tokens or the little pieces,
right,
or people put in place at certain times.
Yeah, and you can remove the barriers, but if people don't feel included, and so that's the other part of the implicit bias conversation, is that how do you create inclusion within a diverse group? And so what does inclusion look like? What are the practices that we engage in that look like inclusion? How do you maintain, like for like White Star was like, we just want you to come in, like you're like, no, I don't know about that, so like how do you maintain your own ethnic and group identities while feeling this part of this greater we? And so yeah, and so everyone's allowed to, to have their own identity and their group identities, but then have this, what we call an inclusive intergroup boundary, and move towards, so we can bring people kind of closer together, so they're more individuals rather than just kind of subgroups and so forth. So in the inclusion research, there are really good models about how to do that. I by the way, if anyone would like to talk about, how we create the common in-group identity model, is like, we're all William Patterson, we're in New Jersey. There's different ways to kind of create those positive feelings for people who appear different or superficially or ideologically, and really connect on those similarities. It's a very effective way to create much greater harmony within a diverse climate that allows people to also maintain their sense of personal autonomy and group identity too, because I think some inclusion programs make people kind of lose that, and that's really counterproductive. So you should be able to be members, be Jewish and Black and Asian and so forth, but also be a part of the this larger community that we all connect to and that we all love as well.
Okay. Our next question is from Ian Marshall. Aren't some biases good? Like, isn't too good to be a bias against racist and sexist? So not all biases is bad, right? Are bad, right?
Do you mind if I take that one?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, great. That's why I call them habits of thinking. I talk to a lot of people about bias, and so I do some anti-bias training, and people are like, oh, yeah, they're going to tell me I'm biased. I don't like that, so there are some biases that are good. As academics, we have expertise. We're experts in our area. We have expertise and habits of looking at, you did such a nice job, picking out those quotes and how you're selecting things. That's expertise that results in a bias and a preference for looking. That's a result of a high level training. So that some habits are good. And it's that, but rethinking them, they could be even better though. I talk about thinking habits, whether we're making business decisions or people decisions, we're doing it in a lot of complex information. It's being aware of what information you're actually using when you make those decisions, and being able to state those reasons to other people. So the hiring scenario is one place that is fraught with bias. The traditional interview where you sit down and try to gauge whether someone is a good candidate for hire is terrible predictor, and it's fraught with bias because mostly it's like, do I like you? Now we know that when people are interviewing for whether you like that, and the interviewer is white and the other person is of color, it's harder to figure out the points of connection, and so that's gonna change the evidence of what you see in terms of potential. So there are structured ways to do interviewing. I actually teach people how to do this in terms of getting that bias out. So and some biases are good, that you have preferences, right? Preferences, bias, habits of thinking that allow you to make decisions very quickly, efficiently, and without overthinking and without kind of overanalyzing. So yes, the more you engage in something, you do have biases that can be advantageous. Were you thinking, Dr. Marshall, of something in particular, a particular bias that you have?
Actually, that was a version of a question that came to me. The person also included the idea that there's actually a contradiction between universals and absolutes, having to do with relativism. In other words, this question of absolute biases versus it being relative to one's socioeconomic position. These are all it's perhaps a bit more complex than the way that it's being presented here. But I thought that getting at that key issue of bias as it relates to individuals who may in fact be profoundly anti-racist and anti-sexist, it puts that question of bias in another position, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you have anything to add there?
Okay, so our next question comes from Aaron Tesfaye. Is there an international dimension also to this, European white nationalism?
Well, I absolutely think so. I don't think that it's a coincidence that we also see a rise in European nationalism at the same time that we see this rise in, as Donald Trump came to power in the United States. There's the same exact year, there's Brexit happening in Great Britain, right? And then a few months later, Donald Trump is elected. And both of those are driven by the same types of fear of the outsider, of this being our country and having to maintain and retain power and remove those people who are trying to take what is ours from us. And so I think those parallels are absolutely present. And it's, Great Britain is just one example, but I know that there's been this upsurge in the past few years in European nationalism in Germany as well, in as I said, Great Britain. I mean, we're even seeing this type of thing happening in Brazil as well, right? Where a very Trump-esque president was elected in Brazil in recent years. And so there's absolutely, I think, a correlation there.
Okay. Next question is from Mark Ellis. If bias is deemed a social problem, everyone has a different stake in addressing and correcting it. It seems as if the outgroup marginalized are the ones pointing it out. This grinds exceedingly on a daily basis. What is the long-term impact on doing bias correction on outgroup individuals? How do you get offenders to change and know before they transgress?
The burden is on the outgroup, right? So the burden is on the outgroup. I think, but also what I've seen is that there's a lot of people who are technically in the majority in group, the privileged position, who really care very intensely about their bias and do really think about it in creative ways of how they can change it. And it's not just, it's not. They're signaling, right? They're allies, right? They're signaling with lawn signs, with going to marches, doing things, and that, that's one way of signaling it. But then, like, creating bridges, I talked about inviting the stranger. How many friends do they have of different racial groups? How many people do they commune with people who are different socioeconomic status? That's really, I think, where it changes, and really get those dual perspectives and lenses there. But I hear you, Dr. Ellis, regarding kind of the burden being on the person who's receiving that. And so, and what I hear from a lot of, as I live kind of in, I'm white, and I think about my whiteness a lot. Even, I read Peggy McClintock's, essay back in college. I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. So that's Unpacking the White Knapsack. If you don't know about it, it's a really good read. But we are privileged that we don't have to think about our whiteness a lot. And it's like kind of rethinking that and the feeling of being othered. It's not, and what that means for people who constantly have to think about that. And what I see is sometimes there's like a little bit like, like I could, the kind of classic is, Danielle, tell me everything like about what it's like to be Black, and then they become like the object of study, and that feels creepy and weird too. And that's not the right approach either. But can we have honest conversations across race that allow us to kind of hear each other perspective without it just feeling like you need to teach me, like like you need to go educate yourself, like find out, learn about Black history, learn about what Reconstruction meant, learn about the Jim Crow laws, learn about Brown versus Board versus education, and what the sequence of things, what was slavery about. I love, Danielle, that you pointed out like Republicans and Democrats weren't like the kind of Republicans and Democrats that we have today, because a lot of people don't understand that. Kind of have that cultural competency regarding our history, so you understand why it's occurred in this particular way. A lot of whites don't understand the anger of Blacks in America. Like what's the like they really have this sense like what's the problem? I think if you understood the history and you understand what it meant in terms of when you interact in this society, that there's this residue that you carry around with you all the time. So, really trying to motivate, whites to be more caring and interested in terms of history, and what that means for them in this society. Be good citizens.
Yeah, I think that, this is kind of, again, we're getting these like huge, how do we fix it questions. And I kind of say that the onus is often put, as Dr. Ellis pointed out, on those people who are being aggressed against, right? That those people who are experiencing the offense are very often the ones who are given the responsibility of educating about the offense. But the power to change does not rest in the hands of those individuals. The power to change rests in the hands of those people who are very often the aggressors. And so it becomes the obligation of that group to, yes, educate themselves, to learn differently. It also requires a complete rehaul of how we do things, how we educate people, right? I'm talking from kindergarten up, that it shouldn't be the first time that when you get to William Patterson University and you get into, say, my classroom or Dr. Heinz's classroom, that this is the first time you're hearing about bias or learning about race or racism or getting in, a better understanding of how the world works. I say in my classes, in the very first week, we are not going to sugarcoat things. We are going to talk about things as they are. And so the way that you're used to talking about this, we're not going to do that. And you're going to be uncomfortable because I'm not going to pretend that, colorblindness exists and that, I'm not racist exists. We all have these biases. We all have these things built, that kind of, you talked about the thumbprint, right? That's there. It's indelible. It's present. And it's about exposing it, talking about it openly so that we can move past it and figure out ways to get around it. If we continue to dance around the issues, then nothing changes.
I think we have time for one more question, and that's going to come from Tia.
Yes. Good morning, ladies. Once again, thank you so much for your great presentation. I have a question from Dr. Hill. She says, in what ways does race and implicit bias play a role in the way the January 6th rioters are being brought to justice? And in what ways does accountability for their actions matter?
Okay, if I'm understanding the question, sorry, these are just like great questions, and I could teach a whole lecturette on that. If I'm understanding the question correctly, Tia, if you could help me out. So, if they have it, a lot of people think that if they have implicit bias or unconscious bias, it's outside of awareness, therefore they're not accountable for it. That's nothing could be further from the truth. I hope it's coming across that everyone has these particular ways of thinking that are inherent in all of these. It is up to you to make sure that they don't create havoc. Are you responsible for a bias that you don't know that you have? Maybe is that another way of saying that? Does that sound fair? Yeah. Like was just said before, you should know that bias exists, and that's why I asked that question. How many of you think that you're less biased than other people, more biased? Most people think that they're less biased than other people, and therefore they don't have to correct anything. I think just kind of acknowledging that and kind of saying like, yeah, I have these kinds of ways of thinking that aren't really optimal in terms of how I think about people. In terms of our understanding and the culpability or the responsibility for bias, I think we're moving towards a place where, yeah, everyone is responsible for their thinking specifically. And there's difference between thinking and behavior. Okay. So you can't charge someone with a crime based solely on thinking. I think, I'm not a lawyer, but it's the behavior that is the problem. But we know that these often have the seeds of the behavior. So, yeah, and it's with the insurrection this last month, it's that bias was not implicit. I don't need special tools to test that. They were very explicitly, and also part of their identity was about holding these particular beliefs. So we don't even need to take an implicit bias for that. But I think for everyone else, are we responsible for implicit biases? Yes.
I think, thank you for that question, Dr. Hill. I think that in regard to the ways in which enforcement of law took place after the fact, I think that we can let's not talk after the fact. Well, let's talk on the day of, right? I think what was happening and what I was kind of hearing from many people of color was, as they were watching, they were kind of saying, where's law enforcement? Where are they? What are they doing? Why isn't anyone stopping them? Because many people said, if this were a crowd of Black people, brown people, Muslims, they would have been put down immediately, violently, by law enforcement. And so many people said, what's going on? And then we look at, we kind of get a better picture of law enforcement, some officers taking selfies with these individuals, right? Kind of opening the barriers and opening doors for them. And then that's when we see like, oh, even though we know that those biases are present in everyone, it's like, oh, they have those biases too, so they're with them, right? And that means then that leads them to not enforce the law equally across the board, right? That a Black Lives Matter protester is going to be more aggressively dealt with, even though they're not breaking into the Capitol building, than an armed white man might be, who is breaking into the Capitol building, right? And
Thank
so that,
you.
I'm sorry.
I just want to thank you both. I just want to acknowledge that this was a fantastic opening to this event. I want to thank you both, Dr. Heinz and Dr. Wallace. Our 11 o'clock session will begin in 10 minutes. We're going to move to a brief intermission. We will start back up right around 10:59. So please come back to this space. If you like, leave your computers on. We have a great intermission from William Patterson University's own jazz band. So please stay tuned. And thanks again. This was a great opening. Thanks.